Warning: the story you're about to hear is disturbing. Author Nick Rachel from Reddit's No Sleep forum shares a story with us that will make your stomach turn and your spine freeze solid. You see, prison is a terrifying place, as we all know, but the things that often happen inside that we don't know about are the most horrific of all. One man's father is an ex-convict who is ready to share his stories from his time behind bars. These are Tales from an Ex-Convict. My father spent 14 years locked behind the thick steel doors of the Barry Telford State Penitentiary, located right outside Texarkana, Texas. Recently, I took an interest in the darker events that have happened to various family members, and sat down to ask him if he had any chilling stories or experiences he could share about his time he spent incarcerated, anything that he hadn't shared with me before. I was both pleased and horrified, as for the next 2 hours, he divulged some truly chilling and grotesque tales. I will just let you know now that some of these stories are graphic, and if you have a weak stomach, I'd advise you not to read further. For the rest of you, I won't sparse details, and I'll lay them out exactly as he laid them out to me. My father was sent to the Telford unit a few months after his 21st birthday, sentenced to 20 years for armed robbery. It is a maximum security prison designed to mostly hold suspected gang members and violent criminals. The first day is a total shock to your system. You're stripped and cavity searched, coming in and out of every room. You've got a bedtime, you're timed at meals and thrown into a cell with 3 other inmates, telling you the house rules and which bunk is yours. Then laying in bed that first night, that's when it hits you that this is home now, that this is your life now. Out of anything I can recall, that feeling of helplessness and hopelessness, that loss of freedom, that's the scariest part of prison, he said. He told me as the months passed, you get used to your routine. You start to need the structure, even crave it. He said he decided to make the best of it, learn as many skills as he could, and stay as busy as possible. One of his vocational skills he picked up was plumbing, and soon became the in-house plumber for A building. Now, the way the prison is set up is that there is an A building and a B building. Inside of each building, there are 10 cell houses. Each cell house contains 12 cells that can hold anywhere from 1 to 4 inmates each. In the middle of each cell house is the rec room, where the cells all open up, and this is where the inmates spend most of their free time. In addition to the cell houses, each building also contains several solitary wings labeled from A Seg to Z Seg. When I first got there, everyone kept joking that if I stepped out of line, the guards would send me to M Seg. One day I asked a buddy, who had been locked up for 15 years already, when I got there, why people kept talking about M Seg and not any of the other Seg wings. Look, his buddy told him, people who have extended stays in M just don't come back the same. Some don't come back at all. The guards know it. That's why they always fill M last, or put new guys there who think they might be troublemakers. And not in M, and you'll straighten your act up real quick. I've never been there myself, but I talked to a couple inmates who have, and they both told me the same thing. Something evil lives in that place. So, like I said, my dad had become the on-call plumber for A building. He said it was about 6 months into the job when he had his first encounter with M Seg. It's a real mess down there. I've seen a lot of crap in my day, but this is crazy, the guard told my dad as he led him down the connecting corridors. Just make sure you wear your gloves and booties, Rachel. My dad was curious and asked the guard what had happened. A Looney Tune on suicide watch. I guess somehow must have stuck in a piece of metal. Look, I shouldn't tell you this, but I don't want you to be surprised when you get in there. Crazy cut off his own, downstairs area. Threw his giblets out on the run. But we can't find his, shaft, and that's where you come in. When they reached their destination, there was another guard standing outside with an inmate holding a mop, waiting to clean up after my dad was finished. My dad said they opened the door to M Seg, and it was almost hauntingly dark. 4 or 5 dim overhead lights ran down the hallway, but seemed to act more like spotlights and gave off practically no ambient light. He said there was a trail of red leading toward the back of the corridor. Each Seg block had 14 cells with solid steel doors, and each door had a small window that could be opened and closed from the outside, and a tray slit, which the guy used to toss his balls out. As he got closer, he could see that the red was running out from a cell toward the end of the block, through a small gap under the door. "Open 13, the guard yelled to another guard behind a glass window, controlling the electronic locks. When I went into that cell, I couldn't believe how much blood there was. It was on the walls and on the ceiling. The entire mattress pad was doused in it. The toilet was flooded up to the brim, and it looked like it was filled with red. I used a cup to transfer the red water into buckets until I could start to see the silhouette of something under the water. I could see a big wad of toilet paper, so I pulled it out and I set it on the floor. I could tell something was inside it. As I started to slowly unravel the wad, all of a sudden I started hearing this noise coming from the air vents. Tunk, 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 it sounded like. It was like someone was crawling or trying to sneak through them almost. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I'll get back to that later. Anyway, I unrolled the paper, and sure enough, the guy's pecker was right there. The guard took it and dropped it in a bag of ice, and after making sure the toilet flushed, he started leading my dad back to the entrance of M Seg. When we got down that hall waiting for the exit door to open, all the lights went out. "The hell?" muttered the guard. "Against the wall, inmate." I stood back against the wall, my dad continued. And as the guards tried to figure out what was going on, I heard that noise in the vents again. It was coming from the cell I'd just come out of. Tunk, tunk, tunk it went. I didn't know what it was, but it gave me the most awful feeling. And as I was standing there, I realized it was getting louder and faster and closer to me. Tunk, 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 tunk. It sounded like whatever was in that vent was now in a full sprint right at us. The guard was trying to ignore it, but I could tell he heard it too, because he kept looking back over his shoulder and started yelling at the guard behind the glass. Hey! Tunk, tunk, tunk. Hurry! Get this freaking door open! Tunk, tunk, tunk. Just as the noise in the vent got up to us, the lights came back on and it went silent. The door opened up and the guard got us out of there as fast as he could. A few days later, I saw the inmate who was waiting on janitor duty that night and asked him if he had seen anything. He told me he saw them wheel a guy covered in crimson fluids out on a stretcher and that he was screaming about a man in the vents and that the man had told him to do it. My dad also asked if he had heard anything in the vents while he was mopping up, but he told my dad he didn't hear anything, but he did find the metal the man from 13 had used on himself. It was buried in a pool of blood, the guy said. Damnedest thing too, looked like a piece of shrapnel cut out from air duct metal. The next story my dad shared with me is even more graphic and scary in the sense of what human beings are capable of. We get new guys that think they're going to be badasses all the time. Sometimes it works out for them, and other times it don't. There were lots of serious gangs in BTU, and sometimes you get a guy who comes in from a local street gang who doesn't really comprehend how violent some of these big gangs are. It's like they're playing gang to look cool. My kids play cops and robbers. Problem is that they think other people are just playing gang too or something, but they're not. Anyway, we had this one guy, Ricky, come in, and everyone but him knew it was gonna end badly for him. He was this young Hispanic guy, and he thought his small town gang was a direct rival to another Hispanic gang, MS-13. He would curse out and disrespect them in front of everyone at chow time and in the halls, and scream at their members who'd pass his cell. He'd only been there a week. Some of the elders tried telling him he needed to calm down before he got hurt, but Ricky was hard-headed and just wouldn't hear it. Well, one day during dinner, the chow hall was quiet, and Ricky was nowhere to be seen. My table was dismissed first, and as we made our way back to our cell house, we turned the corner to see Ricky there, covered in red, stumbling towards us, arms wrapped around his stomach. He was completely naked, big patches of his skin cut from his body where his tattoos had been. Both his eyes were popped out, just dangling toward the ground. The side of his head was caved in where they had stomped on it. As he came closer, I could see he was holding his innards in his hands. The worst part to me is that he hadn't died during it, that he was conscious for every blow and every cut. He just hobbled up the hall in our directions, crying and asking, "Why can't I look up? Why can't I look up?" He collapsed and passed out a few seconds later, then passed away right there at our feet. They never found who did it. Alright, I'll share one more story my dad shared with me. I found kind of creepy, as this is getting pretty long. About 7 years ago into his stint in prison, my dad said through a series of circumstances he ended up having to stay the night in M Seg. The A building was being renovated and repaired, and as a result, they were sending the inmates to stay in Seg in waves. Well, it had been years since my dad had been to the rarely used M Seg, and he had convinced himself that he was just hearing things that night. They were leading prisoners out one cell at a time and transferring them to the various Seg blocks. My dad's cell was on the end, and he had his cell to himself, so when they transferred him, he wasn't accompanied by any other inmates. To his dismay, all the Seg blocks had been filled. Except for M, that is. They led him down to the end of M and opened the door to 14, which was right next to the cell the man had hurt himself in all those years ago. Everything was fine until lights out. It was really dark in there. Each cell had a little nightlight thing above the toilet, but it's not enough to see anything, let alone read or write. Anyway, it was so dark, I figured the only thing I could do was go to sleep. But all night I kept hearing the guy in the cell next to me talking to himself. The way the cells are set up, the vents carry any little noise to the adjoining cells. The vents themselves are located right at the foot of the little cots in each cell. People would sit next to them to communicate and pass time during stints in solitary. But this guy wasn't talking to me. It was like he was talking to himself, and it was really starting to wear on my nerves. I banged on the vent and told him to keep it down, but he just kept talking in this whispery voice. But it sounded like he was chanting the same thing over and over, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. I put my ear up to the vent to try and see what he was saying, and my hair stood up on the back of my head when I swear to God, I felt his breath in my ear as clear as day. I heard him whispering, "I remember you. I remember you. I remember you." "Well, you won't remember nothing when I bash your head in if you don't keep it down in there," I told him. All of a sudden, his voice got a little louder and angrier in tone. "I'll slit your throat. I'll slit your throat. I'll slit your throat." I was a little unnerved, but I've heard a lot worse after so many years in prison, so I just told him to screw off and decided I'd let the guards deal with it in the morning. Well, morning came, and when the guard brought me my breakfast, I told him if he didn't do something about that guy keeping me up all night in 13, that I would do something about it. What are you talking about, Rachel? You're the only person in M Seg. The guard told me as chills ran down my spine. That night, as soon as the light went out, the whispering started again, and this time I was petrified. I'll slit your throat. I'll slit your throat. I'll slit your throat. The whispers were more aggressive this time, clearer too. Then all of a sudden, it went from whispering to deep guttural screams. I'll slit your throat. I'll slit your throat. I'll slit your freaking throat. It scared me so bad I fell out of my cot and scooted on the floor until I felt my back hit the wall opposing the air vent. As my eyes came into focus in absolute horror, I saw the silhouette of a head directly inside the vent. I couldn't make out its features, but I saw its eyes. They were full of hatred and rage, and they were locked right into me. Fast and louder, he just continued screaming that he'd slit my throat as the vent casing started to shake. Now the vents go straight up into a duct, to a main duct, then back down to the next cell through another duct, so you can't see into your neighbor's cell from your cell. That meant whatever this thing was, it was right inside my vent. I jumped up and banged on the steel door as hard as I could, telling for a guard. Someone, help me! A guard came running down the hall, and as soon as he slid the door window open, the vent went silent. You gotta get me out of here. Something's in those vents, I pleaded. To my surprise, the guard didn't protest my request. Instead, he just told me to hang tight for a second, then clicked his radio and said, "Need an open cell for a transfer from M Seg." He paused for a second, then leaned back into his radio and simply said, "He's back." He opened the door and led me down the corridor, and as they did the whole time, we were followed by that familiar sound in the vents. Tunk, tunk, tunk. I've seen and heard a lot in my years. Not a lot gets under my skin, but I was shaking like a leaf the whole way out of M Seg. I don't think I took a breath until I walked out the blocked doors and heard them shut behind me. I finally worked up the nerve to ask the guard what the hell was in those vents. I don't know, Rachel. Warden will tell you there's nothing in those vents, but all I can tell you is that whatever it is, it's evil. My dad told me some interesting rumors and theories about who the man in the vent might have been, and even a theory as to why the guard had said he's back, tales of a failed exorcism, and a cover-up by the warden, as well as a few more spooky stories both related to and not related to M Seg that some fellow inmates had shared with them. If you want to hear any more, my dad has plenty more stories from his time as a convict.